I want to talk about a difference between modernity and modernism. Whereas modernity doesn't attract my positive gaze, it's basically just so much thin air disguised as something. Modernism was a legitimate artistic, aesthetic, and intellectual movement. Modernism had a lot to offer, especially in the early 20th century, because it was an encouragement or incitement to go deeply into subjectivity and to be rigorous about what one finds there, not to shirk acknowledgement of the negative aspects of what one may find there. It wasn't squeamish about mentioning these aspects of the psychology that were not pleasant, not desirable, not happily entertained or entertainable, just very negative aspects, but they were mentioned as part of intellectual rigor and emotional rigor, because it was an attempt to bring the two together so that they were no longer enemies, no longer fighting, no longer at odds. And I do believe, regrettably, we've lost that trend of modernism, so we do not actually know what it means anymore. We think, and I believe from responses I've received, that people think that if you are being rigorous in that manner, that you're just trying to attack them surreptitiously with informational knowledge that could somehow undermine them or threaten them or damage their reputation or make them seem less than they are. And that was never the agenda of modernism. The agenda was simply to be as rigorous as possible, to bring the intellect and emotion together, to make them chime together as one, and to create a unity, a sense of wholeness in a world that is constantly fracturing itself and moving away from wholeness. Surrealism in the early 20th century had a similar agenda, except it was more radical. It was a more radical stream of modernism. It was like your unconscious mind is where it's at. It tells you the truth, and your conscious mind is just regimented. It's stiff. It's formalistic, but your unconscious will reveal something that's more to do with organic nature, more to do with the substance of life, the free-flowing blood or vitality of life. So get in touch with that instead. So it kind of reversed the dynamic whereby people had been taught that they simply must conform, go to World War I, have a good time, get gassed. It's a gas. And they were taught, well, they weren't really taught. They were hinted at that, maybe that's not it, not where it's at, not what you should be doing, not the way to live a life. So you turn it upside down, and you might get a radically different perspective. Let me mention right here that turning something upside down, turning the perspective upside down, is a very effective response and technique and tactic in a very extreme situation, such as World War I and World War II. But the Surrealists came about after World War I as a shock, a cultural shock and recognition of the gravity of what had occurred. And that's why they were so extreme. They said, well, just turn the whole thing upside down, get to the emotional essence of what it means to blow yourself up, what it means for civilization to disintegrate into pieces, what it feels like to be physically torn apart by weapons. Think about it, understand it, realize what you're doing, realize how weird it is, how distorted, how contorted, how emotionally warped and bizarre all of that is. Turn it upside down. So it was a strategy to come to terms with oneself again in a very extreme, very radical situation. And the, uh, the counterforce is always um, appropriately measured by what the initial force is. If the initial force toward um, unreflective violence is extreme, then the counterforce must also be as extreme. And that was why surrealism was extreme. Just surrealism was about know the emotion, know the sense of this kind of sort of complete opposite or dreamlike visceral reaction to the overly conscious, overly regimented, overly dogmatic ideology of war. Marichira was a similar kind of character who appeared in Zimbabwe, and his reaction to that regimentation was in turn very similar, but was informed by very rigorous principles relating to the intellectual and art movement of modernism, which was actually very new to Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe was pre-modern and still in many regards is, even though it has now somewhat joined the global community. So everything about action and reaction and artistic movement has to do with context. If you grasp the context, you do grasp a great deal. Not everything, but you grasp more than you had done before. It's all historical context. It's all the situation and the situatedness of the particular action and reaction or counter-reaction. When I did my PhD, it was very difficult for me to do it because I was in a situation where I was taken out of that fundamental context that I was trying to critique and comment on. And different issues were represented to me as more salient, more purposeful, more relevant. But I didn't think so because I still had much of the psychology of that old style, and I wanted to bring to light and give meaning the relevance of the older style critique that came through Dambudzo Marichira, and that was still relevant in terms of what Zimbabwe is and what it was. It's not so much a relevant critique to contemporary Western culture. It's peripherally or slightly relevant, I suspect. But to Zimbabwe, it was completely pertinent, completely appropriate, and even good medicine, absolutely necessary. This modernist rigor, intellectual and emotional rigor, was very purposeful, very good indeed. But in another context, it's harder to understand, and it does require lots and lots of rigor to understand it. It requires historical knowledge. It requires a sensibility that can put a different mood and different attitudinal stance back into its original context and understand why and how those will be or would be relevant to the original context. And it takes a great deal, in other words, of not just narrow specialism but broad-based intellectual skill to be able to manage that. And these days people are in academia taught narrow specialism, narrow specialities, and so makes it almost really impossible in many, many regards to be able to slot things back in place and say, well, we get a broader picture of the whole. So we probably get a picture of part of the whole instead. That's the manner of modernity, but not the manner of modernism, which was trying to make things back into a whole. I posted under the previous video, and I'm not sure whether it came through or not, whether I was posting a link that had to do with my own access as a moderator to my own site, so I'll try to make amends. I wanted to post something about artistic failure because it's the mention of it and the investigation of it is true to modernism. Now, modernity dislikes and repels and hates the notion of failure of any sort. It would seem to me the narcissistic moderner will accept only perfection, a perfect image of him or herself in the mirror, and anything else will fight tooth and claw against to prove wrong. No matter what it takes, and I think we all know what that means. But Dan Buchtel was different. He was more organic. He was old school. He was old school, but schooled in modernism. So very organic, very honest, very disciplined, in fact, by the Anglican Church and those principles of high Anglicanism. Another kind of super ego school of discipline, which is akin to what I experienced. Do what's right for duty, don't do what's right for you. Old school. And I think it builds a lot of stoicism. I think it builds a lot of resilience. It just does. And that kind of suits you to modernism, which also demands emotional and intellectual rigor, but intellectual rigor kind of through an emotional means, being emotionally honest and true, even about the negative or disgusting or repulsive circumstances one finds oneself in. In the short extract, and I will post it below. I thought, well, maybe I could read it, but I think instead I'll just post it below in full. Merit Jurist speaks about how he reached kind of the end of his tether as an artist. He had some early artistic success, and it kind of dwindled, and in proportion to his attack on the Zimbabwean political regime and other political regimes, including the white liberal community. So he made enemies, but this was part of intellectual rigor. It was part of artistic rigor. And then he got to the end of his tether and back in Harare, where it's kind of a dead end in terms of any kind of intellectual foment or development, sort of very conservative, even after the revolution, or maybe especially so. But I'd say the stagnation was just very much part of that third world or developing world context, and the kind of conservatism that embraces. So he was a very capable intellectual, extremely capable, extremely daring, extremely artistic, and decided to live on the streets rather than succumb to pressures to conform and do what was considered normal, but very, very, very kind of cloying, very repressive, still kind of in a 1950s mentality in many respects, even though it was a post-revolutionary circumstance. Didn't want to do it. I think he had a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder from abuse by authorities, didn't want to submit to any authority by a certain point and didn't. Saw that as his integrity not to submit, and lived on the streets for 18 months, and he didn't help his post-traumatic stress disorder because you can be mugged while you're asleep. If you're sleeping on a park bench, you need to sleep half awake. So it actually worsened his mental state. He ended up drinking a great deal, ended up coughing up blood, ended up somehow succumbing to the AIDS virus. And I don't know what that was all about. I really don't believe he was that sexually active. He was old school. He was very, very repressed. So my own suspicion is that when he was asleep, because he made problems for the regime, the political power, he may have been stabbed with an AIDS infected blood syringe while he was asleep. I think it not impossible. He was followed around by the CIO, the Criminal Investigation Organization, who are now actually beating people up in Zimbabwe and framing them for crimes they didn't commit. So this is something that happens. It's hard for a Westerner or first worlder to wrap their mind around it, but it is actually happening. It's what's taking place. It has tended to be the case. You're more vulnerable if you're black than white because you're less believable and you are less publicly, you're less, you have less of a public profile, probably. You disappear back into the masses, and something very negative can happen to you. Publicly visible, I meant, yeah. Even an author like Dambudzo would have been less publicly visible because people forgot him so long as he wasn't entertaining them and fulfilling their agenda, often a white liberal agenda to seem holier than thou. So I'll post the artistic failure episode just below this video. It's really grueling. I think narcissists in particular, I think that they may be triggered by that. I'm not sure. They may not be able to cope with that level of emotional honesty. So beware if you're a narcissist. You may have trouble. You may have trouble with that. But otherwise, hope it's informative.